I'd like to welcome everyone to the third day of the inaugural History of Medicine Week. This session is titled The Joys and Perils of Relevant History. And my name is Adam Biggs, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I'm also the chair of the Education and Outreach Committee for the American Association for the History of Medicine and the series host. The History of Medicine Week is the product of several conversations that took place in committee and with the AAHM Council, and is part of our organization's larger mission to build meaningful connections with communities that extend beyond our familiar academic networks. The theme for this week is broader audiences, meaningful engagement, and that's what our fantastic group of panelists will be talking about today. The moderator for today's panel is the extraordinary Scottie Buehler. Scottie is a midwife turned historian of medicine. She's an assistant professor in the Department of History and director of the Medical and Health Humanities program at Sam Houston State University. Her current book project is titled Reproducing Midwives in France and the Atlantic, 1750 to 1820, and argues that midwives played a central role in the increased regulation of childbirth and that their education buttressed ideas about sex, class, and racial differences across the French Atlantic. Scottie is also a member of the Education and Outreach Committee and played an important role in conceptualizing this event. So I'm going to turn things over to her and let her run the show.
Thank you so much, Adam. And it's such an honor to be here today with such an esteemed panel of scholars who've all gathered to discuss these joys and perils of relevant history. I do want to go ahead and just introduce everybody at once, and that way we can have more of a dynamic conversation going forward. So first we have Sarah Handley-Cousins, who is an associate teaching professor at the University of Buffalo. She's the author of Bodies in Blue, Disability in the Civil War North, co-author of Spiritualism's Place, Reformers, Seekers, and Seances in Lily Dale, and co-editor of the Nursing Clio Reader. She is the executive editor of Nursing Clio and producer of Dig, a history podcast. She currently serves as president of the Disability History Association and the secretary of AAHM. Jeremy A. Greene is the William H. Welch Professor of History and History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, where he serves as director of the Institute of the History of Medicine, founding director of the Center for Medical Humanities and Social Medicine, interim director of the undergraduate program on Medicine, Science, Humanities, and co-editor-in-chief of the Bulletin for the History of Medicine. Dr. Greene's research explores the way in which medical technologies influence our understandings of what it means to be sick or healthy, normal or abnormal on personal, regional, and global scales. He has published numerous books, including The Doctor Who Wasn't There, Technology, History, and the Limits of Telehealth, Generic, The Unbranding of Modern Medicine, and Prescribing by Numbers, Drugs and the Definition of Disease. His newest research project, Syringe Tide, the Disposable Technologies in the Making of Medical Waste, focuses on the shift towards disposable technologies in hospitals and clinics and the inevitable environmental consequences. He received his MA in anthropology from Harvard and MD, PhD degrees in the history of science, also from Harvard. He completed his residency in internal medicine at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in 2008 and practices medicine at the East Baltimore Medical Center, a community health care center affiliated with Johns Hopkins. He's been recognized by numerous awards, most recently the 2021 Nicholas Davies Award from the American College of Physicians for outstanding scholarly activities in history, literature, philosophy, and ethics. And Dr. Greene has also received a Guggenheim Fellowship for Study during the 2023-24 academic year. And finally, we have Rana Hogarth. She's the associate professor of the Department of the History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of Medicalizing Blackness, Making Racial Difference in the Atlantic World for 2017 with the University of North Carolina Press. And it examines how white physicians define Blackness as a medically significant marker of difference in slave societies in the American Atlantic. Her work has appeared in the Social History of Medicine, American Quarterly, African and Black Diaspora, an International Journal, American Journal of Public Health, and in the edited volumes Medicine and Health in the Age of Slavery and the Keywords for Health Humanities. She also served as the historical consultant for the NEH-funded project Innate, How Science Invented the Myth of Race, a distillations podcast and magazine that launched in February 2023 from the Science History Institute. She's currently at work on her second book, which examines the process through which early 20th century eugenicists measured the fitness of mixed race people, specifically those of Black and white ancestry. This new book aims to draw connections between slavery-era ideologies about race and the burgeoning eugenics movement. Now, I would like to get this conversation started, and we can go in the order of the introductions. And I would like each of you all to take about 5 minutes to respond. And maybe if I can offer a compound question. First, I would love to hear your thoughts on what we even mean by this phrase, relevant history, and along the way, answer this question of how we as historians of medicine can use our scholarship to make meaningful connections beyond our familiar academic communities. Sarah, if you'd like to start us off.
Thank you so much to Adam and to the committee for putting this awesome series of events together. I'm so glad to be part of it. I was reflecting on sort of how to sum up Nursing Clio to answer these questions. And I think what I sort of landed on is that this is really why Nursing Clio exists. This is why Nursing Clio was founded. It, as many of you probably already know, was the brainchild of Jacqueline Antonovich, who during the 2012 presidential election, which seems quaint to us now, there was a kind of a flub, I guess we can say, by Mitt Romney and said he had binders full of women. And this kind of made Jackie pause and think about, how women and women's history appear in the public eye and how there seemed to be a dearth of that, particularly with particular focus with women's bodies and reproductive health in general. And so I think for us at Nursing Clio, what relevant means is trying to produce work, trying to put work out there in an accessible way that speaks to the questions that people outside of the academy have. When something happens in the news, when, we certainly live in a moment where there are conversations happening constantly about abortion, about miscarriage, about the meanings of those things, people are going to turn somewhere to get that information. People are curious and they're going to want to know sort of the context for those things that they're seeing in the news. And I think for us, we try to publish essays that speak specifically to those kind of moments. That's not to say that I think that we publish things that are slanted in a way or that are produced in order to send a particular message or whatever, but more so that we're trying to speak to specifically what we think the demand is. What is the questions? What are the questions that people have out there around these things? And for instance, one of the things that I think is really vital is I don't think that the public necessarily gets a lot of history of abortion, for instance, and reproductive health, which makes up a lot of the core of what Nursing Clio has done. And I think that you likely think differently about abortion today if you understand the history of abortion. And so I think that our goal is to try to provide that history that is relevant to the questions that people have today in accessible ways. And I can speak more about that, about how we do that in the Q&A if there are questions about that.
Yeah, I have so much to say about this, but I think one of the interesting things to think about relevance is how it's sometimes seen as a hindrance in academic spaces, right? This idea that if your work is relevant, if you're too engaged, if you're in the space of advocacy, then you're compromising your reputation as a scholar. And, this field has contorted itself around this for a while. But there's this other element of relevance, which has to do with the notion of presentism as well, that if you actually make your work too relevant, that it actually has this problem of then being dated and not being timeless and being sort of, the monograph that is now something that its introduction is tied to a set of politics that's in a specific moment and then doesn't actually speak in that long-term scholarly way. And I guess that's this narrow way of saying, well, who the us is. And one of the interesting things about this space, and really just, building off of what Sarah was just saying is like, why do we have this restrictive notion of an us that is interested in what history of medicine is in the first place, and where does that come from? And part of it comes from institutions like, like the one that I'm at Johns Hopkins, which sought to define the field for a while since its founding in 1929, or ways in which how the AHM understands who comes to history of medicine meetings, and we don't understand this breadth of interest, really this continuous resurgent interest of the vitality of history of medicine as a field that actually engages so many people's imaginations for so many different reasons. And so I feel that for me, this broader question, and again, I should actually say, one of the reasons you can't see me is that, in terms of the promise and perils of relevance, that right now, like this morning, I was called down to testify at a workshop in the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine about the changing landscape of DEI, or specifically anti-DEI policy, legislation, and legal actions that has been taking place, and is a very live field right now, which has a lot of hazards that I can speak to more when we get to other questions. But I also need to be at my clinic at 1 p.m. to see my first patient in East Baltimore Medical Center. And so you're getting me right now. There's a particular set of perils that I'm here driving on the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, and so there's a peril of an accident. There's all sorts of things there. I am hands-free. But what I mean to say in this space is that as we take on the intense relevance our field has for so many different possible audiences, there's the perils of the forms of accountability that comes with reckoning responsibly with those sites of engagement and being pushed out of our comfort zones and being pushed into spaces where we're called to answer for things in which oftentimes as historians we can feel more comfortable stepping back and saying, well, this thing you think is simple is more complicated than you think it is, or this thing you think is new is older than you think it is. And then we're actually, we find ourselves in spaces where we have to do more than that, and we have to lean in. So I'll leave it at that right now to let the other panelists speak. But I think this question of what relevance is and how we valorize it, or why we've devalorized it in some implicit ways as a field of historians, is just, there's so much to get into there.
Okay, so I will take a quick stab at this. I will, of course, say thank you so much, Adam, for organizing this. This is fabulous. What I will say, just in terms of like the relevance of history of medicine, I guess I take this from like a very like maybe personal approach, is I just intrinsically think history of medicine is relevant because of the topics that we cover, like illness, health, bodies, like there's so many things that history of medicine sort of as a field to me is sort of extremely relevant, but it sometimes might not be relevant in ways that like general publics understand that it's relevant. Like, so for me, somebody who studies like race and medicine, it's sort of, race is pretty relevant. It continues to be. And so it's sort of interesting when, there was a lot of, or there still is like a lot of discussion about sort of racism in medicine. And, it almost seemed as if like during the pandemic, there was a sense of like, there is racism in medicine. Can you believe this? And if you're a historian, you're like, yes, there's a history of this. Let's talk about that history. And it is helpful in that way, I think, for me to say, what are some of the maybe problems that we might think about as sort of social ills or like sort of these big political ills, and sort of in some way I can see like roads leading to, well, there's actually a history behind that. And some of that might be related to like bodies, identities, health, knowledge, expertise, like things that we all kind of brush up against in our work. So I've always kind of found, talking about something like race, but thinking about it in sort of a medical way, has people seem interested in that simply because either they're like, I didn't know that. What do you mean what do you mean physicians were thinking this and that? Or people sort of saying, I have this feeling that the profession looks this way because of, systemic racism. It's like, well, okay, we can talk about that too. There's a lot of these ways that what historians of medicine do really, I think, are just sort of naturally make sense as like being generally relevant. That may be, my bias, maybe I've been like doing this too long, but I do find that when talking to folks outside of the academy, those circumstances, there's like a sense of, there's a recognition like, oh yeah, this is important, or either why didn't I know this history, or, oh, hey, that's messed up, or, hey, can you come tell these people about that? Which is like sort of, in a sense, okay, that's great. Like you feel like you are doing something and you're kind of being active in that way. Certainly, like, there's that distinguishing between like sort of being activist and sort of like, going and sort of initiating, creating initiatives per se, or testifying and that sort of thing. But then there's sort of for me, I guess, like, I don't want to say like behind the scenes, but just the idea of saying, in the act of writing an essay or a piece, or then, donating your time or volunteering your time to speak with folks and sort of share and get questions from people, that to me is a way of kind of being proactive, or at least attuned to creating a conversation around topics that, again, people might not have realized that's a history of medicine topic. So when people think about health disparities, social determinants of health, I'm like, that's got history of medicine written all over it. And those are things that are certainly now and of a very political, have this kind of political weight and currency. But, health disparities, that's been around for a while. And there's like a lot of really great work that historians of medicine do and talking about that. So for me, I guess, in terms of relevant and sort of engaging publics, before I finish up, I would say the willingness to have the conversation with folks who either are receptive or have questions, or are sort of, like being receptive to just kind of speaking to folks outside of academia, to me is probably one of the best things that I have done as a historian, because I've learned a lot. Like, how do you communicate effectively? What are some of the things that I've been talking to other historians that I've just taken for granted that other folks might not be aware of? What are the things that I can learn, the kinds of questions that you get when you talk to folks that are not academics? It's sort of, when you go to a conference and someone's like, yeah, I actually have more of a comment than a question. It's kind of different when you go to other places where people are like, I have questions. I have a lot of questions, like this, and this, which actually quite refreshing. So I think in some ways, being willing to think about what you're studying or what your area of interest is as a historian of medicine, historian of science, and thinking about the ways that actually like is just part of society and day-to-day life, and like how this could be translated, this could be a conversation starter, this is something that I could get folks interested in, is sort of, for me, I think a really important aspect of what we do. But also, if you find the right people, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, the right people who can help you convey the message, that's like super key. So I'll leave it there. We'll get to that later.
Thank you all. And yes, I think as historians, we all deeply understand the way in which medicine and science are part of society. And so there's a way in which if we try to extract it, pretend like it's not, that's just it's just false, right? And it actually takes a lot of work to try to do that. So I would love to hear more, and you were starting to touch on this there at the end, and Sarah mentioned accessibility. So what are some of the specific practices of finding the right people, of making your work accessible, of building these connections outside of academia?
I can start by answering that. I think there's different ways of defining like what accessibility means. For Nursing Clio, we think about that in terms of like how every essay is written and what it's about. So I think I think there's like two parts of it for us, right? It's like, it's making sure that the essays are written in such a way that you do not have to be inside of academia. You don't have to have taken the classes we've taken and read the texts that we've read and go to the conferences we go to in order to understand what this is about. And so it's like, it's really vital to like be able to take these ideas and then communicate them in a way that people can understand, that invites people in rather than sort of demonstrating our intelligence or our sort of being in the club, in other words, of the academy. And so sometimes this means, we as editors have to do a lot of work sometimes with our writers to refashion how they write. A lot of us are taught to write the opposite of that. And I don't mean to say that we're like bad writers necessarily, but that we are taught to write in very sort of specific genres and to very specific audiences, right? Where you might, for instance, open an article with a historiography section, right? Nobody wants to read that in Nursing Clio. Like, my mom or something who's going to read a Nursing Clio essay is like, this doesn't mean anything. And more importantly, it shuts off a reader and they're gone, right? Like the people are only going to stick around for so long. And so the editors have to do a lot of work with our writers to help them to sort of reimagine how they communicate this stuff. Sometimes it's things like, the structure of an essay, taking out that sort of academic ease. Sometimes it's also making sure that you're giving people enough information that if they don't have the same sort of contextual information that you have as a scholar of this field, that they can still access the history that you're telling them, right? One of the other things is that we also really encourage our authors to have like a hook, coming back to that first question about relevancy, having a hook at the beginning of their essay or within their essay that connects it to something that is going on today or is relevant to people right now. So, for instance, we've had essays that are about, I don't know, I'm trying to come up with a good example here, that are connected to a television show. We did a whole series on romance novels, trying to find these things that will almost like the bait and switch sort of thing. Like, you thought this article was going to be about Grey's Anatomy, but actually it's about the history of medicine or whatever. And that sort of, I think, helps to invite people in. It speaks to people's interests outside of the academy and then explains to them why it's relevant, why this history is relevant to them, right? The other thing, a little bit less at Nursing Clio, but more in the other project that I work on, which is DIG, the history podcast. One of the things that we saw as our mission there was to take the scholarship that happens inside the academy and put it into a format that would be accessible to people. So a little bit less of that primary research and writing based stuff that happens at Nursing Clio, where people are really trying to share their arguments, share their interventions with a larger population, right? A larger audience. At DIG, we are trying to use our podcast to shine a light on the hard work that historians are doing inside the academy by highlighting those books and articles that maybe my mom or my brother aren't going to read, but they might listen to a podcast that is explaining to them what historians have said about a particular subject.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sarah, that was great. I want to add kind of quickly, when we think about, if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's, who are the vehicles or what are the methods by which we can reach these broader audiences that we mean when we talk about relevance? And I think we all mean different people, and sometimes each of us mean several different people. And I want to think quickly about four, which is, practice, policy, general public, and then communities we're accountable to. And I'm not going to spend a long time talking about them, but the common ground here, though, is the similar concept of how does one reach to a common set of values of concerns in which the importance of the work that we're doing and the storytelling that we can achieve through historical narrative becomes relevant, right? So with practice, like when I first started becoming a historian on the faculty of a medical school, I would meet with people and they'd say, yeah, history is fascinating, but like, how can you be doing stuff that's meaningful? Or then they'd get to know my work and they'd say, oh, that's actually really meaningful, but do you have to call yourself a historian? Couldn't you call yourself a sociologist? That sounds more scientific, and so that was kind of like, cut my, internal organs out with a spoon kind of thing. But I realized that they were trying to be helpful, right? Which is that this framing of actually, here's a set of common values. Here's empirical research. Here's what the research that goes into doing historical work does that is relevant for the present that we're in and for this common set of concerns that we have. And I think a very similar thing happens in policy. Like, what does history offer the world of policy? Well, a whole set of options of a larger solution space that we occlude if we only limit ourselves to the things that we think about as the present day answers to our policy problems. But it still comes back to translating it into the common set of values. What do people need in policy? They need a new way to look at the problems they have and solutions, and history can give it, right? When we think about the general public, Sarah's comments there are so helpful, the hooks, the narrative. So we do storytelling. And so we have such an incredible advantage to capture the imagination of broad audiences that find our stories compelling for reasons that relate to their own personal challenges. But we have to imagine them as readers that, don't know our jargon and that, but know a good story and that can be moved to a robust argument through good storytelling. And then the last one I want to linger on, though, is community partners, because here it gets much more complicated, right? Especially when we have community partners that have good reason to be suspicious of the academic institutions in which we reside. So, I'll give you an example of this current project I'm working on about histories of medical waste and medical incineration. There is a company called the Curtis Bay Energy Company, which is the largest private medical incinerator in North America. Curtis Bay is also the name of a neighborhood in South Baltimore with the highest rates of pulmonary disease in the city and by substandards in the country. And so I'm currently working with some remarkable community activists, community partners in South Baltimore, and it's their story. And I want to make it clear that it's my story. And it's not even me trying to translate what I do as a historian and its value to them. It's almost the inverse. Like, they're already historians and they've been doing a remarkable job telling their story, not necessarily getting it received in all the areas it needs to be, but actually in some ways getting it heard in ways that I would have no idea. Like, they're very good strategically at getting stories heard. So it's this process of how I can help work as a historian, work with a group of people who already are historians, but then helping to translate the value of that history and in an open-ended way that is really, so this is one of the challenges of relevance, because if you're doing relevant work for communities, then it's really important not to lead, but to understand and hear where the relevance comes from them. And I wanted to leave that there.
I think I'm kind of going to be echoing a lot of what has already been said, although with a slight caveat here of, recognizing that, historians, we have this kind of expertise. We study, we research, we are like know something inside and out. And then there's that sort of tricky thing, that sort of translating. And so, Sarah, you had alluded to this in terms of, okay, we got to get rid of the jargon. Like, I love hearing about Foucault and the carceral state in hospitals, but I can imagine somebody's eyes glazing over. So what has been actually really helpful for me, and something that I kind of learned and appreciated a lot, I had the opportunity to work with the folks who created the Innate podcast, like the Distillations podcast, and like they are professional storytellers. They know what a narrative is, they know what a hook is. And so I was like, as much as I was like, oh, here's a historian you should talk to, or here's some information about, the history of race or the history of that, watching them work and like listening to the podcast, I'm like, oh, that's how you get people interested. It's not just like, oh, we all know race is a social construction. It's like, how did science make this myth? It's like, oh, that sounds a little bit more interesting than telling you that race is a social construction, which we've heard over and over and over again. It's like a way to understand how they get people engaged. And so for me, I've kind of been really appreciative of learning the process of like how to translate that into a very like well-researched, informative story about something that, is a historian. It's like, it's deep historical research. It's really troubling, but it's like kind of a story you want to keep listening to and hearing about it. And so that to me is actually quite tricky. I think it's actually hard just for one person, like for the historian to basically say, okay, I have this thorough research, I have everything done together, and now I'm going to make this story compelling and exciting for people who might not know that they're interested in it. That's the other thing. Like, people might say, well, I've heard of Tuskegee before. Well, here's a different angle of the story. Have you thought about Tuskegee and the concept of other kinds of like race-based therapies? How do you like tell or put a spin on a story that people might say, okay, I know about it, or for people who are, maybe less interested, or maybe say, well, that was a long time ago, and say, no, this is still relevant to you now. I think that that's something, the idea of partnering with, particularly, I think, to Jeremy's point, to community members who are already historians, who know like their kinds of own local and community histories, learning from them and understanding like how you can kind of work together and sort of integrate like each specific expertise, just in the same way of sort of looking at the work that I did with the folks with the Innate podcast, like kind of learning about how they get a narrative going, the kinds of ways that they put information together. Like, it's sort of, for me, it's a learning experience, but it's also a great way of sort of bringing work as a historian to sort of a broader public. But it's also like you're learning that process yourself, like, oh, this is maybe how I could start that story if I was going to talk to like an audience, right, of non-academics. So I think that, the idea of like the method. So I've had experience working with this podcast. I've done like sort of public audience lectures, and I've learned one other thing that I think kind of maybe is relatable or can be relatable to the public. And that is sort of a sense of showing your work. And by that, I mean, sometimes there's like this mystery behind what historians do, like this idea that we just have some opinions. We look at old things. It's like, okay, well, I think it's nice to sort of now be really open and say, okay, I'm going to show you the document I looked at. We're going to look at it together. You're going to be just as much. So what I saw, you can see this too. So it's less that I'm talking at you and I'm telling you, I'm basically saying, when you go into this space like this, think of this archival space, which in and of itself is not a neutral space, but you go into the space and here are the words on the page. You might be like, well, what am I going to do? What does this mean? And just sort of showing sort of the steps that you take to come to the conclusion that you reach, or to like sort of make that case that you're making. So it's that your audience kind of feels like, okay, it's something more real, right? It's totally different if I just say, okay, here's a picture of Benjamin Rush, and here's a picture of Richard Allen, and these are the people who were involved in 1793 yellow fever. It's like, okay, that's great for maybe a quick didactic lecture. But if you want to dig into the story, I'm like, this is a letter that Benjamin Rush wrote. And he's like telling you about the panic that's happening. And here he's literally referencing race. And at that point, there are moments where I think for audience members, they might be like, oh, it's written down. It's there. It's like, yeah, I didn't make this up. Like, that's the other thing. I think, for people who might be like, well, what do you really do? If there's a question about like, what is the relevance of historians? What do we really do? It's kind of a nice way to kind of give people a glimpse of that work that we do. And I think in that way, that can also help to kind of bridge a receptiveness to the kinds of stories that we want to tell, that we want to share with broader publics.
And Rana, if I can just kind of follow up with you on that, because I think you're also sort of articulating really a powerful way of communicating and sort of confronting folks when you may find them hostile or antagonistic to the work that you're doing. And I remember quite distinctly, a time when you were being interviewed on a television show where you had a hostile caller, right? And I was actually kind of stunned that they somehow didn't filter that out to begin with. But I thought you handled it really well. And I'm wondering, for each of our panelists, could we say a little bit about maybe the approaches that you use to, you're all dealing with such hot button topics that connect with people in really sort of, viable and meaningful kinds of ways that you can get reactions that are often less than, welcoming. And maybe we could talk a little bit about how you manage some of those.
I will say, Nursing Clio has gotten a certain amount of this. I don't think that we've gotten as much as I think people expect, especially because we publish so much on abortion. We moderate our comments section pretty tightly. And so if I don't like something that someone has commented, I simply don't allow it to be published. But we don't get a ton of that. We really don't at Nursing Clio. I know that many of our authors have gotten pushback, not so much even about what they've written for us, but almost like what they've written or what they've produced in other areas. So I know that we have encountered, our authors have encountered that. At Nursing Clio, we've encountered less of it, with one really interesting exception. And I'll say the biggest problem that we had with pushback did not come from the public. It came from a scholar who was very upset with something that we published about Florence Nightingale. And it's really fascinating to me because we certainly, I think most often the conversation that, like the question that you just asked, is about, when you take this touchy stuff, when you take this difficult, complex stuff and you put it out there in the public, people are going to not accept that well. People are going to consider it whatever, revisionist history. They're going to consider it activist. They're going to consider it, I don't know, woke, right? Whatever it is. But our biggest hater was somebody who was inside the academy, who was really invested in a particular interpretation of someone, a historical figure, and was really upset with the way that we presented that, or the way that our author did. And it led to some really interesting conversations, shall we say. I will say I've gotten a lot more pushback on the podcast than at Nursing Clio. And I think one reason for that, and one of my theories, is that there's something a little bit more personal about listening to someone's voice telling you something than maybe there's more of a remove when you're reading something, right? And no small amount of the pushback that we've gotten at Dig has been about our voices. We don't do video-based content. We considered it for a while, and a lot of podcasts are moving towards video-based content. But we didn't do that, partly because when we've posted pictures of ourselves recording on, say, Instagram, we get a lot of incredibly hateful, misogynistic comments about the size of our bodies, about the way that we look, whatever it is. And so I see that more with Dig. And I think that it has something to do with the way that the content is delivered. Maybe the people who listen to history podcasts, who seek out history podcasts, right, are maybe a slightly different audience than who is reading Nursing Clio. So that's where I've gotten that kind of pushback. And when we have gotten it, it often confirms to me, especially the criticism that we've gotten, say, for the podcast, that's about the content that we put out. Often that just confirms to me that we're doing good history. It's like, bring it on. Criticize us for talking about women. I'm sorry. Like, it's reaffirming to us that there is a desperate need for that kind of history to be out there, because people don't want it to be out there, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense, Sarah. I was just going to add that it actually kind of proves the relevance of history in general, that the historical narratives are so potent and powerful that it'll draw people out in this way, right? The other panelists?
So I'm happy to jump in, but, I think a lot about this question of harm. And I'm thinking a lot about it right now in terms of, this event that I'm just coming from. My job as a historian in this particular policy arena was to address this space of anti-woke backlash in state, local, and national policy arenas. And there's really organized malignant entities that are doing a lot of work to take people's words out of context and then virally spawn them and troll. And we've seen several examples of this, especially in relation to attacks on people doing DEI work in medicine and academic medicine in this country. And so, there's a bit of a challenge because my job today was to give a historical framing, partly in a way that goes back to Flexner and tries to tell the Flexner story in a complicated way, not just Flexner as hero, Flexner as villain, but also Flexner as someone who understood himself as a race liberal, who actually, after the actions that led to the closing of 5 of 7 schools for training African-American physicians, then went on to funnel a lot of money to Howard and Meharry and then becomes the chairman of the board for Howard. That doesn't exonerate him. I'm not trying to resuscitate his reputation, but that's the job that we have as historians, right? Is to tell these stories in a ways that take away the insulation that we have between the past and the present and actually help inculcate real critical sensibilities. But part of my job was to describe the work of this group, like what are these entities that are so successful right now in spawning legislative and legal challenges. And, I'll refer you all to this remarkable essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones in the New York Times Magazine earlier this year, which starts with the admissions office at Howard University School of Medicine receiving a lawsuit from a Liberty Constitution Center, newly emboldened post-SCOTUS hearing, and stating that if Howard intends to try to unconsciously admit Black students for the sake of training Black medical professionals, they will be sued. And the sense of trying to make sense of that in historical perspective is this great galling challenge, which is part of the political moment we're in, but also trying to understand these entities, which also do things like mount giant, billboards with people's faces on them and quotes taken out of context to get them fired, which happens in many schools that we've been at over the past year. So knowing that I'm giving a talk that's a history of this entity, do no harm, trying to track how it came from, what its rhetorical strategies are for audiences, knowing that it's an open-ended space in which they're definitely watching, right? And so what I'm trying to say is not, oh, I'm being so brave, but rather saying, I need to be in the space leaning forward, but I also need to not make unforced errors. And it puts a different kind of pressure on what it means to organize a talk so that no single sentence that I utter could be taken out of context and used for malignant purposes. Now, that could be said even of this conversation. I'm treating this one as if it's not, but who knows who's on the other end of it, right? It's an open Zoom call. But at the same time, it's a very different kind of pressure, and it's a real set of peril. And, for many faculty, like I'm relatively insulated in that I've got I've got tenure, I've got a, endowed chair where I am, right? Like, I should be able to take these sorts of risks, right? But that especially for folks who are in less secure positions, and that's it's the majority of people in the field, right? It's like there's a chilling effect in that space. So that's this larger peril of relevant history, of how to understand the malignant entities out there that don't even want to engage with your scholarship on its own terms once you enter these spaces, and how not to make unforced errors, how to almost insulate your work so that you lean in where you need to, and it's worth it if you face the consequences, but it's not twisted against you.
I mean, I will say, I know that there's like this rule, right? I guess it's like an internet comments, like even if you give people evidence, even if you tell them things that are like, those people will just still dig in. And I mean, I guess I'm a bit like stubborn because like I am like I love the archive, first of all. I'm an archive rat. I love the archive. That's where I'm like in my happy place. And every time I go there, I learn something. I'm surprised. There's like twists and turns. And I want to instinctively share that with people. So particularly, I don't think I've gotten nearly as much backlash as other historians that I know have, but people really like Benjamin Rush. And that's fine and that's good. And there are, people who are sort of like, oh, are you saying he's racist? I'm like, that's a strange statement to make. I'm like, what? It's like kind of asking the question of like, what does it mean to even one say that he's like racist in the 18th century? Like, explain how that, like, what are you trying to elicit from making such a statement? And the idea is that it sort of like comes down to, here are his words, right? And here's the context that we live in. If there's something that, if you want to say, well, he doesn't mean it, or if you want to inhabit his head and say, well, that can't possibly be what it is, that is kind of left to the audience member or the person who's upset by this. But for me, I have to say, look, when we look at evidence, right? And again, I want to steer clear of like a kind of presentism, because I do fully believe that someone like Benjamin Rush, for example, truly thought he was a friend to African Americans in Philadelphia. I think he believed that. And that's fine and that's good, but he also lived in a world where it made perfect sense to assume that Black and white people were not internally the same. And so that we have to reconcile those things. And we have to consider that if his idea of trying to rehabilitate the idea of Blackness is to say that maybe it's a kind of skin disease, and like you're shifting the blame onto the Black person. That's just a reality. You're not asking the question of why are people choosing to view Blackness in this way. You're saying, okay, well, what if this was a pathology, as a way to think your way out of the, the troubled nature of slavery, that this is what his view was. And so for me, I'm always about, what is the nature of your question? What is at stake when people kind of get mad about something that they have wanted to believe? And so for me, I always like to just dig into the archives to understand what the sources are, to understand the context, and say, here it is. Like, I don't get points. I don't win anything if this person who you once revered doesn't seem as rosy and wonderful. I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of interesting to think about how people are, and that some of the figures we study, they're people. We are people. People hold all sorts of contradictory, strange, cognitive, like that is the nature of people. And so I just find that when you say, well, how can somebody who is an abolitionist do this? I'm like, there's reams of evidence that show us things that abolitionists said about Black people while they were also saying slavery is bad. There is just so much in the historical record. So I'm just sort of, for me, I just have to remind people that the world is kind of full of contradictions. People are full of contradictions. You don't get to have a neat and tidy, here is just the story. In some ways, it's almost insulting to the historical figures when you flatten them and make them sort of like a Disney caricature. Like, oh, this is a person good, this person bad. That's not necessarily how it works. I don't think it works that way at all. So I think, I think I've been lucky. Just in terms of like the kinds of strange backlash I've received, but it's out there. And I think to Jeremy's point, one thing that does concern me is for, early career folks, people who don't have the kind of security in academia, it can be hard to make statements. It can be hard to put out information that maybe people don't want to hear, even within academia. So not just the public, within academia. And so I think it's kind of, important for all of us who maybe do have the security to kind of be watching out for each other in like a helpful way, and sort of saying, okay, how can we offer support? How can we kind of recognize these kinds of moments for our colleagues and our peers doing this kind of work? So
thank you all. We have an audience question from Dr. Kylie Smith. She asked, I wonder if the panelists could talk a little about strategies for translating even within academia, but across disciplines, where scientists or health faculty are sometimes less likely to believe that history is relevant.
Thanks for that question, Kylie. I think it's a skill all of us need to keep building. One of the things that I think has been really helpful is to just not, I think I started off somewhat defensive in this space, and I've learned that, to riff off of some of what Rana was saying, actually leaning into our fields, demonstrating the empirical basis, the methodological sophistication, the amount of work that we do really goes a long way towards that. In the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, I was asked when I became chair, did I want to caucus with the other basic sciences chairs? And so I went to the meeting, and I realized that there's a really strong case to make simply by saying history of medicine is a basic science of medicine. Now, we could have a long conversation about that and what's entailed in it, what goes in it, but it helps just to say, okay, well, what is a basic science? And how do I translate what we do in history of medicine into basic sciences? And actually, it's really not that difficult once you listen to where folks are coming from. I think Rana was just saying this, understanding what folks' concerns are and what matters to them. So understanding what counts as value for rigorous research in the fields, and realizing that what we do can be translated into almost any different field once we understand the stakes on the other side. That's all I want to say.
When I was lecturing at Illinois, I had a lot of, it was like a engineering school, so it's like science, computer science people, and I was there to pad their transcripts. But they, I would refer to things as my data or my evidence. I would show them sometimes. I'm like, okay, so you want to know this information? I'm like, let's look at the evidence. Where's the data? how do you make this statement? I was like, a thesis can't fall out of the sky. And I cannot just, much to the chagrin of students, I do not just like drink coffee, read the New York Times, and then make something up and put it on a slide. That is not the life of the professor. I actually have to read through sources and understand and look at what is available. And if it's not there, it's not there. So there are like cases where I'm like, I can't, like students will say, well, don't you think this is what this person meant? I'm like, that evidence isn't there. I can't just tell you that. It's a possibility. It's a question one can ask. You can dig into the historical record, but I'm not just going to tell you that without the evidence. Like I can say we can speculate. We can, piece things together with contextual clues. But absent that, you're kind of like there's no evidentiary support. The same thing with essays and papers. You're like, well, I'm like, you didn't use any evidence. You can't just, opinions are great, but you do need evidence for what we do. So I think being particularly clear, especially if these are disciplines that pride themselves on observation, of measurement, of pre-test, post-test, et cetera. I think there are ways, just as Jeremy alluded to like sort of translate what we do, because the training is rigorous. We all know this. So
two sort of brief things. I think one, I'm very proud of the fact that Nursing Clio is often assigned in classes. Like we have great, speaking of data, we have great evidence to show that our essays are being assigned all around the world. And a lot of those classes are of future doctors, right? They're in those like early health humanities or medical humanities or history of medicine classes that those pre-med students have to take. And so that is something that I'm glad to see, right? The other thing that I'll say is that Nursing Clio has always tried to be pretty active in soliciting essays from people that are not professional historians, and particularly from clinicians and people who are working in these fields. We've been really happy to publish the work of midwives, of nurses, of doctors, of people who are working in all different areas of kind of practitioners of medicine. And that, I think, carries a different kind of weight too, in terms of translating outside of our field, right? And helping to get people to pay attention to what it is that we're saying. When we say that like our authors include people that from the inside history and sort of the historical profession, but also that we have these stakeholders within those other, perhaps more skeptical fields as well.
Adam, are you wanting to jump in here?
Yeah, I feel like we're just getting warmed up. But we gotta.
But we gotta wrap up.
Yeah.
Do we have time to do a real quick go around, and maybe if everybody could do one or two sentences on the joys of this work? I would love to end on a place of joy and optimism.
This is a good problem. And I think it's a good problem that we have so much to talk about that it doesn't fit into an hour. I think that's exciting. I think that's one of the joys of this work, is that it keeps us excited about what we're doing. I think it's tremendously exciting to me that people read Nursing Clio and that people are interested in what we have to share. And I am continuously excited about the ways that we can take what we do inside the academy and translate it in ways that are meaningful to people in all different kinds of facets of life.
Thanks again for this conversation. It's wonderful. We could go on for a long time, and I really enjoy that as well. I feel like this question about how to think about relevance and how to think about different audiences has been a source of, frustration, of course, but also incredible joy and personal growth for me, and also a sense of gratitude that part of the way I try and think of my writing, right? I think as a writer, you think you can always write better, right? It's a craft. We're always working on it. How do we even come into our style more and more in a way that can tell our stories even more effectively? And so thinking about relevance in different audiences and how to actually write for different groups and translate to different groups, I feel like each step of this, even though the work is challenging, even like the work that, the question that Kylie had brought up, how do we translate? It's an opportunity for what I found to be forms of personal growth that I've taken quite a bit of enjoyment in. And it's such a pleasure to be able to do something that I love and think about ways that it can be meaningful so this chance of like working in this sort of traction area of relevance and how it shifts has been a source of actually quite a bit of joy and meaning for me. And I'm very thankful for that.
I will say this job is ridiculously joyous for me, even though I work on really miserable and depressing things. The construction of race is hard, but I have to say the thing that brings me joy is that when I am working and when I am struggling with something and it's material that is very difficult, if I can get it together, if I can present it, if I can share it with an audience in an article, a presentation, a PowerPoint, etc., and there's engagement and there's question, if somebody's like, this made me think of something else, this led me to think of something else, like that to me is like, okay, it's a lonely job in the archive, but somehow it gets diffused and other people get to take something from it and it can be useful to them. And that is helpful to me because then I don't feel like I'm just spinning my wheels. I'm stuck in a dark archive. Who cares? What can I do? You can't change the past. But that moment when you've shared it and somebody has responded to it and somebody has engaged with it, and maybe somebody has just disagreed with it, but you're still sort of like, okay, the conversation is happening and it all stemmed from still doing what you're doing. So to me, that is actually brings quite a bit of joy and it makes me keep wanting to do this thing.
Well, thank you all for being here today, to the audience and to our panelists. And I'm sure that we will be able to continue these conversations in many other spaces.